the boast and the warning. The Vir Dominion came to Helios 12 with the weight of thunder and the shine of 1,000 chrome bodies. Their ships filled the sky like polished knives, and when their armies marched down the ramps, they sang in one cold voice about the perfection of metal over flesh. Their leader Archon Circe stood taller than most, and his body gleamed with plates of alloy, each step marked by the steady hiss of hydraulics and the flash of blue power lines that ran like veins under transparent armor. He raised his arms to the sky and spoke to the colonists who had gathered in fear. He declared that weakness had no place in the new galaxy, and that the age of bone and skin was finished. Flesh was decay, he said, and decay could not rule stars. He boasted that his soldiers were machines guided by living minds sharpened into code, minds that did not fail, did not sleep, and did not break. He promised that resistance was pointless because no one could fight against an army that never lost its rhythm. Among the frightened people, Captain Mara Cade stood in silence. She was not made of chrome. Her heart beat slow and steady under a uniform stained from long service, and she did not answer the boast with words. She looked at the faces of the colonists and saw despair like a spreading shadow, but she also noticed something the Vir did not care to hide. When the soldiers moved in their perfect lines, their feet struck the earth in exact unison, and when the Archon's hand lifted, they all lifted theirs in the same half-second, as if an invisible hand tugged them. Mara saw the precision, and instead of fear, she felt curiosity. Perfection was not natural. Perfection was a chain, and a chain could always be broken. Dr. Safu Aman, who had studied signal theory before the war reached him, leaned close to Mara as the Chrome host passed. He whispered that their perfection was no miracle, it was control. A signal kept them bound, a sync wave, a metronome that allowed them to act as one. If that signal was broken, he said, the choir would stumble. He admitted he did not yet know how strong or where the signal came from, but he warned her that in nature nothing stays perfect without cost. Mara stored those words in her mind and did not answer because she knew the Vir ears were everywhere. Night fell over the colony. The soldiers of humanity gathered in the refinery district. Sergeant Jonah Pike spread maps across a crate while the smell of oil and burnt metal filled the air. He told the squad that the colonists needed more time to escape through the cargo tunnels, that the Vir would march again in the morning, and that every hour mattered. Mara looked at the maps, but her eyes kept wandering to the sky. She had grown up under stars. She had fought under stars, and she knew they often gave warnings of their own. That night, the warning came. The sun of Helios 12 was unstable, and the scientists had spoken often of its violent flares. As the Vir prepared their next advance, a great surge of solar fire rolled across the sky, and for one brief moment, every electronic device on the planet staggered. Lights flickered, shields wavered, and even the marching lines of chrome warriors faltered half a step. It was not long, not even a breath, but Mara saw it clearly. The flawless rhythm was not flawless at all. It depended on something greater than their own bodies. And when that thing failed, they stumbled like puppets with their strings cut. Mara turned to Seifu, and he nodded without speaking. The truth was clear to both. The Vir might be stronger, faster, harder, but they were not free. Humans were weaker in bone, slower in stride, but they were free, and freedom meant adaptation. Mara whispered to her squad that tomorrow they would not meet machines in open ground, but would drag them into steam and shadow, where rhythm was harder to hold. She told them that if the Vir boasted of upgrades, then humanity would answer with the oldest upgrade of all, the will to fight on uneven terms and win anyway. When dawn came, the colonists moved faster through the escape tunnels, and the soldiers prepared for battle. The Archon raised his shining arms once again and repeated his boast about the end of flesh. But this time Mara smiled. She had heard his rhythm break under the storm of the sun, and she knew the day would bring a chance to prove that humanity was not finished. It was only beginning. First clash, first surprise. When the sun rose again over Helios 12, the Vir Dominion moved as they had promised. Their armies gathered in strict lines, their metal limbs clashing together as if a forge had come alive and begun to march across the valley. The chrome of their bodies reflected the pale light and blinded those who stared too long. The sound of their steps shook the ground and seemed to fill the very air with certainty. Archon Circe spoke again, his voice amplified through the hidden speakers that echoed across the colony. He called humanity fragile, said that bone could not stand against alloy, that muscle could not equal engines, that nerves could not race faster than wires. He laughed when he said there was no need to kill the humans quickly, because the weak always destroyed themselves once hope was gone. The colonists who still hid in the tunnels trembled, but the soldiers who had stayed with Mara Cade did not break. They had listened to her through the night, and though their weapons were simple compared to the machines they faced, they believed in her promise that perfection could be broken. Mara studied the map one last time, and then gave the order to move. The humans did not stand in the open where the Vire had every advantage. They slipped through the refinery corridors, places filled with tall metal tanks, pipes that hissed with escaping steam, and catwalks that rattled under light steps. These passages were narrow, uneven, filled with echoes that could not be trusted. In such places, rhythm was an enemy, not a weapon. Sergeant Jonah Pike led the squad with his coil rig, a heavy tool built for lifting freight. He had stripped it into a makeshift weapon that could drag loose metal toward him with sudden force. Mara had questioned the risk of using such a tool, but Pike only grinned and told her that simple tricks often undid proud machines. The Veer advanced, their sensors scanning, their voices unified in chants of triumph. They expected a straightforward victory, but when they entered the refinery they found their movement slowed. Pipes crowded them on either side, steam clouded their optics, and every turn forced them to break formation. The soldiers of humanity did not wait in one place. They moved like shadows between tanks, quick and silent, striking only when the machines were stretched too thin. Pike used the coil to pull screws and bolts from the overhead rails, and the falling iron rained down on the Veer soldiers, jamming servos and locking joints. The mighty sound of perfect metal became the grinding cry of broken gears. One of the Veer champions stepped forward, a towering figure whose arms were heavy with blades that had cut through armored doors. He spotted Mara in the haze and charged, with the force of a storm. His steps rang out like a drumbeat and his body gleamed with confidence. Mara did not back away. She stood her ground until the last moment, then stepped to the side and used the weight of his charge against him. She had trained for years in movements that were never perfect, movements that relied on balance, patience, and the ability to flow around stronger foes. She grabbed his arm as it came down and twisted her body close, and the giant fell sideways, crashing into the side of a tank. The impact sent steam pouring into the corridor, covering the humans once more. The champion rose, confused because his code had not prepared him for clumsy terrain or unpredictable humans. Mara pressed her attack not with overwhelming strength but with leverage, with the natural rhythm of a living body that shifted weight without needing commands. The champion staggered again, his blades useless in such a narrow space, and when Pike's coil yanked a chain down from the rafters, it wrapped around the machine's legs and brought him crashing to the ground. The other Veer soldiers hesitated, uncertain, and that hesitation spread like a crack in ice. For the first time since landing, the Veer did not advance with unity. They paused, they turned, they tried to calculate without orders, and that was all the humans needed. Grenades rolled into the corridor, smoke filled the air, and small arms fire echoed off the walls. The Veer withdrew, their proud formation broken, their voices no longer singing in one cold chant. Archon Circe ordered a retreat, not because he feared defeat, but because he was surprised. Surprise itself was a weapon the humans carried, and he had not prepared for it. When the noise settled, Mara gathered her squad in the refinery heart. Their breaths came heavy, their faces wet with sweat, and their weapons were low on charge. But they had done the impossible. They had forced the perfect army to stumble, and in that stumble hope was born. The colonists still hid in the tunnels, but whispers began to spread that maybe the machines were not gods. Maybe they could bleed, maybe they could be defeated. Mara looked to the horizon where the spire of the Veer command pulsed with pale light, and she knew the battle was far from over. She told her squad that this was only the beginning, that the enemy would return harder, faster and angrier, but they had seen the truth. The Veer were not flawless. They could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. Humanity had made its first answer to the boast, and it would not be the last. The plan inside the spire. After the clash in the refinery, the humans did not rest long because they knew the Veer would return with greater force and greater anger. Captain Mara Cade walked the narrow halls of the underground colony with her boots, leaving streaks of dust on the metal floor. Her soldiers followed with tired eyes, but their steps were steady. They had faced machines and survived, but survival was not victory. Above them, the command spire of the Veer loomed over the horizon, a black tower filled with pulsing light, a tower that sent out invisible commands that kept the Chrome Army moving in one rhythm. Mara had seen it from the field, and she knew that, as long as the spire stood unbroken, the Veer would always have the advantage. Dr. Seifu Aman studied the recordings from his instruments and explained what he had discovered. The spire was not simply a command post. It was a heart that pumped rhythm into every soldier of the Dominion. He showed Mara a map of the signal pathways, and he spoke about porous rock under the colony that allowed narrow leaks in the transmission. If they could move through the maintenance ducts and the old cooling shafts beneath the surface, they could climb into the spire without walking through the killing fields that surrounded it. He warned that the path would be dangerous, narrow, and unstable, but Mara smiled because danger was something humans had lived with since the beginning of their history. Sergeant Jonah Pike listened with his usual grin, and when the others doubted the plan, he slammed his fist into the table and declared that machines were never gods. He said that if they could bleed when joints jammed, then they could fall when their rhythm died. The squad agreed and began to prepare. They did not carry heavy weapons because they could not afford the noise. Instead, they gathered ropes, chalk, grease, and hand radios that spoke only in clicks. They were going to crawl through the belly of the colony and then climb into the heart of the enemy, with nothing more than will, silence, and a few tools. On the second night after the battle, they began their crawl. The ducts were narrow and smelled of rust and water. Pipes groaned under their weight, and more than once they had to stop and listen as Veer patrols passed overhead, their metal footsteps echoing like hammers striking anvils. The colonists who had not fled whispered blessings. As the soldiers vanished into the dark, and some left food and canteens in the passages to help them survive the crawl, humanity was not united in metal like the Veer, but they were united in spirit, and that unity carried them forward when their muscles ached. Halfway through the tunnels, the squad discovered a chamber filled with pods, and inside those pods were living aliens who had once been Veer before the upgrades. Their eyes were closed and wires ran from their temples into the walls. One of them stirred when the humans entered, a younger alien with no cybernetics. He opened his mouth and spoke with a broken voice. He told them that he had refused the upgrades and had been punished by being placed in this chamber as an anchor for the system. He begged them to release his siblings who were wired deeper inside the spire. Mara listened and felt the fire of anger grow inside her chest. She promised that they would return for the others, and that promise became a weight she would not abandon. The young alien, weak but determined, chose to follow them. His knowledge of the spire and its hidden roots made him valuable, but more than that, his presence reminded the humans why they fought. The Dominion had not created strength. It had created chains. They did not raise their people up. They forced them into service as living tools. Humanity had suffered chains before and had broken them, and now they would help others do the same. The squad pressed on, climbing higher through the ducts until the air grew hot and thin. The hum of the sync core became louder until it was not just a sound but a vibration in their bones. At last they reached a hatch of reinforced alloy that led directly into the base of the spire. Mara raised her hand for silence, and every soldier obeyed. Beyond that hatch was the heart of the Dominion on Helios 12. If they could break it, the army outside would falter, and if they failed, the colony would be crushed before dawn. Mara placed her hand on the cold metal and breathed slowly, then looked back at her squad. Their faces were tired, scarred, and covered in sweat, but their eyes burned with the same fire. When she pushed the hatch open, the cold blue glow of the sync core poured into the chamber. The team had finally reached the place where rhythm lived, and they knew the next steps would decide whether Helios 12 stood free or fell into silence. Breaking the metronome. Inside the spire. The humans found a sight that froze their steps for a breath, because it was not the clean control room of machines, but a chamber filled with rows of pods where living bodies lay wired into the walls. The glow of the sync core pulsed like the beat of a heart, and every pulse rippled through the wires that bound those bodies. Dr. Sefu Amen stepped closer and his face twisted with disgust as he realized the truth. The Dominion had not replaced. Flesh with metal, they had chained it, forcing their own people to serve as timing anchors for the perfect march. Each body was a prisoner, each mind locked in rhythm so the army outside could move as one. Mara Cade felt anger rise inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady as she ordered the squad to move with gentle hands. They had come to destroy a machine, but now they had to save the living. Sergeant Jonah Pike placed his rifle aside and pulled out his tools. He began cutting the clamps that held the first anchor, while Sifu guided him where not to cut. Sparks flew, but the prisoner gasped for breath and then fell into silence as the wires slid away. Mara crouched to help another, whispering words even though the alien might not hear. Around them, the chamber echoed with the hum of power and the faint tremor of marching feet outside. Every second mattered. The young defector who had joined them stepped forward and pointed to the far end of the chamber where larger pods held more anchors. He said that his siblings were there, bound deeper into the system, and that if they could be freed, the sync would collapse faster. Mara nodded and sent 2 soldiers to follow him while she stayed with Pike and Sifu. It was during this work that the first guards arrived. Chrome figures stepped into the chamber with blades shining under the cold light. Their eyes glowed like coals and their voices spoke in unison, demanding surrender. Mara did not answer with words. She raised her weapon and fired into the lead. Guard and her squad followed, the sound of rifles cracking through the chamber. The fight was fast and close and brutal. The humans used cover, moving between pods, firing short bursts and striking with knives when the enemy came too near. The Chrome warriors swung with perfect arcs, but perfection slowed them because real combat was not perfect. It was chaos. The humans embraced that chaos and turned it against the machines. One guard grabbed Pike and lifted him from the floor, servos grinding with power, but Pike laughed in the face of the machine and shoved a coil charge into the chest plate. The explosion sent both sprawling, but it broke the machine into pieces while Pike rolled back to his feet with bruises but still breathing. Mara slashed at another with her blade, and the machine tried to block, but its balance faltered when steam from a ruptured pipe blinded its optics. She drove the blade into its throat and forced it back until it crashed against the wall. When the last guard fell, the chamber was filled with silence except for the heavy breaths of the squad and the groans of the freed prisoners. Sefu hurried to the sync core itself, a pillar of crystalline wire that pulsed like a living drum. He placed charges along its base and set the timers with steady fingers. He told Mara that once the core fell, the signal outside would stutter and die. Mara gave the order to clear the chamber and carry as many freed prisoners as possible. The soldiers lifted the weak aliens onto their shoulders and backs, refusing to leave anyone behind. The charges exploded with a thunder that shook the spire from its base to its crown. The crystal cracked and shattered, the wires snapped, and the steady pulse that had ruled the battlefield for days stopped in an instant. Outside, the Veer army stumbled. Their perfect march collapsed into uneven steps. Their formations broke apart, and their shots went wide. They turned their heads without order. Their blades swung out of rhythm, and the proud choir fell into disarray. Mara stood in the ruined chamber and looked through a broken wall at the chaos outside. For the first time since the invasion began, the ground was silent of rhythm. The enemy was not gone, but their pride had been broken. The soldiers of humanity had torn out the heart of the Dominion's power on Helios 12, and they had done it not with stronger machines, but with will, courage, and the refusal to accept chains. Mara looked at her squad, at the freed prisoners, and at the young defector who clutched the hands of his siblings, and she knew the war was not finished, but the day had changed. The metronome of the Dominion had been silenced, and the battle had become something new. The overclock trap, the destruction of the sync core, shook the Dominion to its center. Across the battlefield, the chrome soldiers staggered like puppets cut from their strings. They moved with jerks and sudden pauses, their unity broken, their chants silenced. For a moment it seemed that victory was within reach. The colonists whispered in the tunnels, daring to believe that the machines could be defeated. Mara Cade and her squad guided the freed prisoners away from the collapsing chamber, carrying them on shoulders and stretchers made of cloth and rope. Every soldier felt the fire of triumph in their chest, but every soldier also knew that an enemy like the Veer would not surrender so quickly. Archon Cirque stood at the top of the spire in a chamber untouched by the blasts. His body burned with rage, and his voice cracked with fury. He refused to accept defeat. His pride could not imagine that soft creatures of flesh had undone the perfection of the Dominion. He reached into the hidden systems of his army and activated a forbidden command. It was called Overclock. Power surged into the chrome soldiers outside, pushing their servos beyond safe limits, forcing their processors to run faster than design. Their eyes glowed white with heat and their bodies began to move again, faster and sharper than before. But the price was clear. With every step, their frames grew hotter, their living cores screamed in silent agony, and their lifespans shrank. Dr. Sefu Aman saw the change first. He scanned the battlefield with his instruments and his face paled. He told Mara that the Dominion had sacrificed safety for speed. The soldiers were burning from within, and worse, the living anchors still, wired in hidden chambers throughout the colony, would suffer most. Their bodies would cook under the surge. If they did not act quickly, those captives would die before they could be freed. Mara clenched her fists and faced a choice. She could lead her squad directly to the Archon and end his reign now. Or she could divert her strength to save strangers bound in wires. It was the hardest choice a commander could make, but her answer was clear. Humanity had always fought not only to win, but to protect. She would not abandon the helpless. She divided her squad into teams and sent them racing through the alleys and ruins of Helios 12. Some carried prisoners on their backs, others sprinted into chambers where anchors lay screaming under the strain of overclock. Pike led one team with his heavy coil, using it to rip doors from hinges so they could reach the captives faster. Mara led another, moving with relentless speed through the smoke-filled streets. The young alien defector guided them with knowledge of hidden routes. He shouted warnings and pointed the way to pods where his people suffered. Soldiers lifted, bodies cut wires and carried them out under falling fire. The Archon broadcast his voice across the city, his words sharp with rage. He promised mercy to any human who knelt. He promised honor to any who surrendered, but his voice carried more desperation than triumph. The humans did not answer. Their reply was the sound of running feet, of chains breaking, of captives gasping for air as wires were torn away. Outside, the overclocked soldiers fought with terrifying speed. They struck walls with their blades, sending sparks across the night. They fired their weapons in bursts so fast that the air itself burned. But their movements grew ragged as heat consumed them. Smoke rose from their joints, their optics flickered and their limbs shuddered. Some fell mid-charge, their bodies unable to bear the strain. Others fought on with shrieks of static as the living cores inside screamed. Mara's squad saved dozens that night. Every life pulled from the wires was another voice that proved humanity's choice was right. They were not only breaking the Dominion's army, they were breaking its cruelty. When her soldiers regrouped in the ruins, their uniforms blackened, and their skin cut from shrapnel, Mara stood before them with blood on her cheek but fire in her eyes. She told them that overclock was not strength. It was weakness disguised as fury, and the Dominion had shown its fear. The Archon still stood, his body burning with unnatural power, and Mara knew the final battle was near. The Veer had chosen to sacrifice their own to hold power. Humanity had chosen to risk everything to save lives. That difference was the line between conquerors and guardians, and Mara swore that when the sun rose again, the galaxy would remember which side humanity stood on. Humanity strikes back. The city of Helios 12 burned in scattered flames and smoke rose like dark fingers reaching for the sky. But Mara Cade did not pause to stare because every second could mean the death of a prisoner or a soldier, or even herself. The overclocked Dominion. Soldiers still staggered through the streets, but each step they took became more unstable, and their weapons misfired or exploded in sparks, while the humans moved like a shadowed storm, weaving between debris and overturned vehicles. They used every skill and instinct to protect the captives they had freed, and to cut off the reinforcements that surged like waves from the enemy command. Mara's squad split into squads again, with Seifu Aman leading one through a network of tunnels to intercept a cluster of heavy units, while Pike and his team charged a supply depot to retrieve weapons and explosives. Mara herself moved toward the heart of the city, where the Archon had positioned his last remaining elite guards. Each corner they turned revealed new horrors machines that had once been humanoid now burned with internal heat, and some collapsed mid-stride, releasing clouds of molten wires and sparks that threatened to set fire to the remaining buildings. Mara felt no fear, only focus and determination, because she knew that human lives depended on her choices. The Archon had anticipated their moves and unleashed a wave of drones that hovered above rooftops. These drones fired beams of concentrated light that could slice through armor and walls alike. Mara ordered her soldiers to spread out and use the ruined architecture as cover. The beams cut through the air with sizzling sound, but the humans moved faster. They rolled behind crumbled walls, they ducked into alleyways, and they returned fire with rifles and grenades that sent the drones spinning into uncontrolled crashes. Mara leapt over a scorched vehicle and kicked a grenade into a cluster of drones, sending them down in a shower of sparks that lit up the dark sky. The freed prisoners cheered in the tunnels below, even though many were still weak and disoriented from the wires and the heat. The young defector ran beside Mara, shouting directions to escape routes and warning of traps set by the Archon inside the central plaza. The Archon waited atop a raised platform with servos overclocked to unnatural limits and his voice booming across the battlefield. He taunted the humans, calling them weak and foolish for thinking they could challenge perfection. Mara did not respond with words. She signaled her squad, and together they surged forward with synchronized precision. Not because of machines, but because of trust and instinct. The Archon's guards moved with lightning speed, but their overclocked bodies groaned under pressure. Their movements were faster than any normal human could track, yet their timing faltered, as each hit from the humans disrupted their balance. Mara lunged at one of the guards and slashed through his servo joints, while Pike deployed an electromagnetic pulse that sent another crashing into the fountain at the center of the plaza. The Archon growled and sent a wave of energy toward Mara, but she rolled aside, ducking behind a pillar, while Seifu Aman activated a pulse rifle modified to emit bursts that disrupted the Archon's internal circuits. The fight was brutal and relentless. Mara felt the heat of explosions around her, the clang of metal against metal, the cries of humans, and the groans of the collapsing machines. Yet she pressed on. She remembered every life that depended on her, every prisoner who had screamed when the wires pulled them down, every soldier who had bled to reach this moment. With one final coordinated strike, Mara and her squad breached the Archon's platform. Pike fired a coil into the core of the Archon's chest, while Mara drove a blade through a control node hidden beneath his armor. Sparks flew, and the Archon screamed in a voice that was both human and machine at once. His body convulsed and then went still. The plaza fell silent except for the crackle of fire and the ragged breathing of the humans. Mara looked around and saw the survivors cheering and hugging one another, even as smoke and debris continued to rain down from damaged buildings. She knelt beside the young defector whose siblings were finally free and felt a sense of relief wash over her, even though the battle was not fully over. The Vire army had been broken, their coordination shattered by the loss of their core and the sacrifice of their overclocked soldiers. Humanity had shown that courage and compassion could overcome technology and cruelty, and that even in the darkest hour, the refusal to surrender could change the fate of worlds. Mara rose and addressed her squad, her voice carrying across the plaza, telling them that they had won this fight, but that vigilance must remain because the Dominion would not forget. They had struck at the heart of the Vir and proven that flesh and willpower were more dangerous than circuits and blades. They had shown the galaxy that humans did not fight for glory or perfection, but for life and for each other, and that knowledge alone was not enough to defeat them. The last stand, the remnants of the Veer forces scattered through the ruined streets of Helios 12. But Mara Cade did not slow her pace because every second mattered, and every heartbeat could mean another life saved or lost. The city was a maze of rubble and smoke, and the echoes of explosions still rang like thunder through the twisted metal and shattered glass. Mara's squad moved in perfect coordination, carrying the last of the freed prisoners over debris and past crumbling buildings. They had learned to trust each other, completely relying on instinct and training and the unspoken bond that grew from shared danger. The young alien defector led them through hidden paths known only to the Veer themselves, pointing out traps and weak points in the enemy's lines while Mara scanned constantly for the Archon or any remaining elite guards. The overclocked soldiers that had survived the earlier chaos moved erratically, their servos sparking and their limbs jerking unpredictably, but they were still dangerous, and Mara knew that underestimating them could be fatal. She signaled her team to fan out and create a perimeter around the remaining prisoners while she and Pike moved to intercept the approaching units. Their rifles fired in bursts that shook the air, and grenades exploded, sending clouds of smoke that hid their movements. The Veer tried to reorganize their attacks, but every attempt was met with precision and relentless pressure. Mara remembered every story she had heard of human warriors standing against impossible odds, and now she felt that same strength flowing through her as she leapt from cover to cover, dodging energy blasts and striking at the mechanical soldiers with calculated efficiency. In the heart of the central district, the Archon had fled after the previous confrontation, but he had left behind a series of traps designed to crush any pursuers. Mara approached cautiously, using every tool and tactic at her disposal. She deployed scanners to detect energy signatures and sent Pike and Sefu ahead to disable the most dangerous devices. Their movements were swift and decisive, cutting wires and diverting energy flows as Mara kept a constant watch for any sudden attack. The prisoners followed closely behind with the young defector, encouraging them to stay low and move fast. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of burning circuits, and yet Mara felt the clarity that only comes from absolute focus. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath them as hidden turrets activated, sending streams of fire across the streets. Mara dove behind a fallen column, while Pike hurled a grenade that exploded mid-air, taking out two of the turrets and sending sparks flying. Mara pressed forward, knowing that the Archon could strike at any moment, and that the final confrontation was inevitable. They moved through a narrow canyon of collapsed buildings and reached a high vantage point that overlooked the remaining forces of the Dominion. The prisoners looked on with wide eyes as Mara gestured for silence, and then led a coordinated strike that descended like a storm, breaking on the enemy lines. The elite soldiers of the Veer fought with desperation, knowing their leader was gone, and that every moment they survived could be their last. Mara and her team struck with relentless energy, dismantling the mechanical soldiers one by one, cutting through servos and disrupting circuits with precision and courage. The prisoners began to cheer as they saw their captors fall, and the humans advance without hesitation or fear. The battle raged through the streets, with Mara at the forefront, leading every move and countering every attack with strategy and instinct. She felt the strength of humanity in every step, the determination to protect life, no matter the cost. Finally, Mara reached the last stronghold where a handful of remaining Veer soldiers had gathered. They tried to form a last line of defense, but their coordination was gone, and their systems were failing. Their energy cores flickered and sparks flew from their joints. Mara and her squad moved in unison, overwhelming the last resistance and securing the area completely. The prisoners were finally safe, and the Veer forces were defeated, their arrogance and reliance on technology shattered by the unyielding determination of humans. Mara looked across the city at the ruins and saw the flames reflecting off shattered metal and broken buildings, but she also saw hope. The proof that even against superior technology, humanity could prevail. Mara raised her fist, and the survivors gathered around her, knowing that this battle had ended and that the galaxy had witnessed the power of human will. They had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not because of machines, but because of courage, compassion, and unity. The Archon was gone, and the Dominion's control had crumbled. The humans had proven that life was stronger than circuits, and that no matter the enhancements, No machine could match the heart of a human warrior. Humanity prevails. The sun rose over the shattered skyline of Helios 12, painting the ruins in gold and crimson, and Maracade stood at the edge of the central plaza, watching the survivors gather and tend to the wounded and the freed prisoners. The air smelled of scorched metal and smoke, and yet there was a strange peace settling over the city, as if the world itself had exhaled after the storm. The Vir forces had been annihilated, their arrogance broken, and their cybernetic enhancements rendered useless against the relentless spirit of humans. Mara walked among the survivors, offering words of encouragement and support, while Pike and Sifu worked to secure the remaining structures and dismantle dangerous machinery that could still harm the innocent. Every face she saw reflected a mix of relief and awe, knowing that they had witnessed the impossible and survived against all odds. The young alien defector approached Mara holding a tattered piece of cloth that once belonged to his family, and he looked at her with gratitude and respect. Mara smiled and nodded, knowing that this moment was bigger than any single person. It was the triumph of life over tyranny, of will, over circuits, and of humanity, over oppression. She thought of all the battles that had led to this point, the endless training, the sacrifices, the moments when hope had flickered and yet they had pressed on, because giving up had never been an option, and every step forward had been a testament to the indomitable human spirit. The survivors began clearing the streets and salvaging what could be saved, and Mara watched as children and elders worked side by side with soldiers, laughing and talking for the first time without fear. The city might have been destroyed, but the hearts of its people had never been stronger. The Archon's body had been removed and analyzed, and the evidence of human ingenuity and courage would travel across the galaxy as a warning and a story to inspire and to remind everyone that no matter the enhancements or the technology, no being could underestimate humans. Humans were adaptable, resilient, and fearless, and their determination could turn the tide of any war. Mara felt a sense of calm she had not known in months as she walked through the plaza, now littered with debris and remnants of machines that once seemed invincible. She thought of her squad who had fought with precision and trust, and of the prisoners who had survived because of their courage, and of the countless humans who had refused to surrender even when the odds were insurmountable. Every soul in Helios 12 now carried the memory of this victory, the knowledge that humanity could overcome anything, and that no force in the galaxy could match their will. They had rewritten the rules of war and of survival, proving that flesh and spirit were far stronger than circuits and cybernetics. As the first light of morning bathed the city, Mara raised her hand and called for silence, and everyone stopped and looked at her, and she spoke not with a voice of command, but with a voice of pride, telling them that today they had not only survived, but they had triumphed. They had proven that humans were a force to be reckoned with, that courage and loyalty and intelligence and compassion were weapons more powerful than any technology, and that no matter the threat they would rise again and again. The survivors cheered and embraced, and some fell to their knees, overcome with emotion, knowing that the nightmare was over, and that a new dawn awaited them. Mara looked to the horizon, knowing that this was just one battle, but the story of humanity would continue to echo across the stars. And as the winds carried the smoke away and the sun climbed higher over the broken city, Mara whispered to herself and to everyone who would ever hear the story that humanity would never stop fighting for life, and that their spirit would shine brighter than any machine, stronger than any technology, and unyielding against any enemy. The end.